So, in response to all the Trump tariff anxiety this week, we started seeing these calls to buy Canadian. But I'm wondering, how does that translate to culture? Like, does that mean we should stop watching American shows like Severance? Today on the show, the meaning of cultural resistance in Canada. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I feel like we've all lived 1,000 lives this week, and it's like only Wednesday. First, it looked like Trump was going to hit Canada with those 25% tariffs, but then at the last minute, they were paused, and they were paused for 30 days. What Trump hasn't walked back is this idea that he keeps saying of Canada becoming the 51st state. Now, I don't need to tell you that Canadians are angry. People are refusing to buy American. Like, they're saying, I'm going to choose Cheesies instead of Cheetos. They're canceling trips to the U.S. I should say Canadians are also booing American sports teams, something I haven't seen since the start of the Iraq War. Those are interesting arenas, I think, for some of these tensions to play out. It's one thing to, I think, choose chips that are made in Canada or say I'm going to opt out of Florida orange juice. But I'm interested in culture. This show is interested in culture. If we accept that our national identity is this deeply, intricately tied thing to the stories that we tell ourselves, what does cultural resistance look like right now? How does Canada actually manage to get out from under a cultural power like the United States? Jesse Wente has been doing a lot of thinking about this, not just lately, but his entire life. Jesse, welcome to the show, friend.
Hi, Elamin. How are you?
Listen, I'm really happy to have you on. I want to make sure, first of all, that we're just to clarify that you're not here in your official capacity as the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. We are getting your own thoughts. We're getting your own feelings. And maybe that's the place to start. How are you feeling, pal?
I feel fine.
Okay.
I understand. I certainly am aware that other people are a little more anxious and maybe upset or have that anxiety energy that comes when there's a disruption to the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say I'm fine. Largely because I'm somewhat removed from these things. I don't do social media really anymore, and I've have an ongoing therapeutic practice that helps me manage. All good suggestions, by the way. I think in terms of how we, but also I think in the larger term, we've been through a term with the current president before. I somehow don't like saying his name like Voldemort or something, but. We've dealt with Trump before. He's done tariffs before. We have history with tariffs in Canada. None of what he's currently doing, outside of maybe one aspect which we can talk about, but most of it seems to be what he said he was going to do and was very directly stated in the policy plans that they had. So I don't know if we should be that unprepared. And then there's the other point of, as an Anishinaabe person. Living here, I guess the idea of some instability in terms of national relationships and how sort of powerful forces want to inflict their ways upon you is not out of the ordinary for our experience here. So the idea of an imperial power deciding it's going to behave differently is not that unusual, or that a treaty partner might decide to not uphold their treaty. These might not be things that are like out of the ordinary for say an Anishinaabe or an Indigenous person's experience here. So I don't know if it's quite as shocking as it may be for folks who have, I think quite rightly, seen America as sort of a very closely held ally and might have to be rethinking that idea in the moment.
I'm glad that you sort of laid out that wider scope of the idea of, hey, when you're next to an empire, when you're next to a large imperial force or a large colonial force, there is an obvious anxiety that comes with just being in that place all the time. And maybe Canadians might be new to it in some kind of regard right now. And so like that is the kind of conversation that I want to have. But I want to have it when it comes to culture specifically, because I think like we've had it on other shows on the network when it comes to politics, when it comes to economics. Our show deals with culture. Our show deals with the stories that we tell ourselves as Canadians, and also the stories boundaries that we are sort of trying to work through to say, okay, this is where our identity might maybe come from. And we're seeing this bit of cultural resistance, like this idea of, an American sports team comes here and they're getting booed. Those are new experiences for a lot of people. How are you thinking about cultural resistance right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm still thinking at Elamin the way I always have, which is probably from a
Mm.
First Nations sort of perspective, which is it's something I would suggest our communities have been actively engaged in since I have been alive, certainly, and I think that's an ongoing
Yeah.
effort. And that's, to be plainly spoken, that is because our cultures were very obviously attacked and under direct threat by the policies and the actions of governments. So that's not to speak lightly. That's very like, no, we had to actually really take some action and try to think through some of these ways to resist because these things were actively trying to be taken away
Mm-hmm.
from us through colonial powers. I wouldn't necessarily call Canada an empire in the way we might think of
No.
America. So I would say I think about it in the same ways. And so some of that comes from, and I think some of this is already reflected in Canadian cultural policy historically, right? Canada, from a cultural standpoint, has traditionally run a fairly protectionist sort of public policy, meaning there certainly since the end of the Second World War, when we had the Massey Commission,
Mm-hmm.
which led to the formation of something like the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as a whole host of other sorts of things. It was always quite recognized, really, since the development of Hollywood in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, that if there were to be Canadian culture, it had to actually be supported at a state level. That from a marketplace standpoint,
Hmm.
they were going to wipe us out. And so there has been real policy, not in a tariff necessarily sort of a way, but if you've ever watched an American show on a Canadian TV channel,
Mm-hmm.
and for example, notice that the ads are different than
Mm-hmm.
if you were to watch the American feed of that exact same live programming, that's an effect of the regulatory framework that Canada set up that protects Canadian broadcasters and helps funds the Canadian broadcast system, right? It
Mm-hmm.
means that if you're to broadcast your American feed into Canada, it has to go through Canadian hands, and they're able to exploit it commercially for that. So we have all of this sort of framework around these things out of recognition that on an industrial scale,
Mm-hmm.
if we want culture here, we have to invest in it and support it. So, and I would say from an Anishinaabe perspective, we have had to protect our culture and take sometimes rather dramatic steps, in terms of ensuring that we would protect what's most important when it was under threat.
So, Jesse, I want to spell out a bunch of stuff that you just said there
Yeah.
because I think that's really important. But also, I want to frame it in the context of this tweet that I received earlier this week after we did a show
great.
at the Grammys. So the Grammys happen on Sunday. Our show this week on Monday is sort of a recap of the Grammys. And I got a tweet that said, "Hey, aren't you a little bit ashamed to talk about an American awards show on your Canadian, radio show the day after, as we're sort of working through all of these tariff conversations?" And I take that quite seriously. I take that comment quite seriously because we are sort of having this national conversation about how much, Canadian culture do we pay attention to? How good are we at paying attention to those things? And everything that you just said there, the idea that Canada runs a sort of protectionist policy when it comes to our culture, to spell that out, like there is a reason, CanCon rules exist on radio, which is to say, if you're going to play songs on commercial radio, every 3 songs, you gotta hear Canadian songs. That's actually that's an intense tariff. And that has created careers for so many different musicians. You mentioned Canada Council for the Arts, CBC is certainly a part of those institutions that specifically exist to uplift Canadian content. So when you look at the role of Canadian cultural institutions, is the role as explicit as it seems to say, hey, these institutions are here to help us become less American? Like, how explicit is that in terms of, that the stated goals or intentions?
I mean, I think it was pretty explicit in a different era. before you and I were around
Right.
to have this discussion. I think it was pretty explicit in terms of the formation of the National Film Board, the CBC, a lot of these sorts of really national sort of cultural
Yeah.
institutions. I think it was quite explicit. Also quite explicit was a desire to actually define and foster Canadian culture. Because we also have to remember that these institutions were founded when the country was very young.
Right.
I as an Anishinaabe person, would still suggest it is still a very young country that is still trying to fully come to grasp with what its culture is. This is an ongoing sort of question. So it was also not just about we don't want to become Americans, which I think is in some ways sort of front and center in a lot of Canadian just culture writ large, and in our sort of cultural policy. But it was also about we want Canadians to speak to other Canadians and sort of foster this. The way I think about it these days, Elamin, is that I think about culture and art and all of these things as fuel or a way to foster belonging. And I think that we're in a crisis of belonging all over the world and in Canada for all sorts of reasons that we probably don't have time in this conversation to get to.
Yeah, we don't have an 8-hour show, pal, but yes.
No, we don't have an 8-hour show. But I think it would be worthy of us to think about our cultural production, because it's important to separate culture versus cultural production, which is the stuff that then that culture produces, which is the movies, the songs, all of that stuff. Then
you got to have a culture. You got to have a culture in order to make
stuff. You got to have a culture in the first place. Yeah. And so I think if we start to think about the reason we want that culture is because it gives us a sense of belonging, and that I think exists beyond corporate or even nationalist sort of sensibilities, but a sense of belonging to a community that then would make us far more resistant to not only the cultural products of other cultures in terms of, like, we may be curious, but we wouldn't necessarily adopt them as ours.
Right.
But we may consume them. And also more resistant to what you mentioned in your intro to this piece, which I think is really the danger that I think this current administration presents, which is they keep talking about annexing Canada. And, as an Anishinaabe person, I know I've mentioned that particular identifier a few times, but it's how I navigate the world. I do have to say, certainly this past few weeks have shown that America probably should not be trusted as a treaty partner at this point. And so I'm already part of a nation that struggles to retain the treaty obligations with the folks we have treaty with, let alone I'm for sure not interested in entering with folks that clearly are not good treaty partners. So I'm less about, I'm glad Canadians are having this interest. And I love when we start talking about how to make this place work better for the folks that live here. I sort of view it less from a nationalist sort of Canada viewpoint, and more what I want to resist is the culture at the base of the cultural product that is Trump, because Trump is a cultural product of the culture of America. And we have to start thinking of being that the belonging we seek will allow us to resist some of this culture that includes right now, a reactivation of some imperial desires to expand territory and things that might be really endangering to any sense of Canadian sovereignty that we actually have right now.
Okay, so the problem with talking to you, Jesse, is that every sentence is like a thing I want to talk about for several hours. So let me just try to sort of like pull together a couple of threads here. I think the reason this anxiety that is coming out in the realm of booing of American national anthems at sports games is that, in addition to the tariff talk, it is also coupled with this idea of Trump wanting to, say, we want to make Canada the 51st state while talking about purchasing Greenland. Yesterday, Trump sort of openly talked about, the U.S. taking over Gaza. Like he is explicitly an expansionist president, or at least he's sort of talking about it in that way. And the role that culture plays in all of this is a very, I think, actually a relatively minor role in terms of, whether it could do anything to stop, those ambitions. However, The reason I wanted to talk to you specifically is because you have experience. You have some experience in saying, okay, there is a dominant culture right outside the gates. We have to turn inwards and make sure that we protect our culture and our story. And that is maybe an anxiety that people are meeting for the first time. So talk to me a little bit about how you even develop resilience against something like that, because I'm sure that a lot of Canadians are listening being like, oh, I don't know how to navigate this challenge at all.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, and it's a great question. And I recognize that it might be something that we haven't had to think about in a while, like this generation,
Yeah.
if it ever. So, in terms of, I would say a couple important things that, like, when I come to my work, the reason I was able to do what I've done, and we can discuss it, or how I've approached it, was because a lot of moves had already been made.
Hmm.
Right. So, in terms of the retention of things like ceremony, language, teachings, knowledge systems, um, that occurred before I was around, and that occurred in the face of really oppressive tactics to try to take those things away.
Yeah.
And there were tactics that then our community used, strategies we used to protect those things, including hiding some of them, you know, which is the most desperate thing is when you
Hmm.
take things underground to say, we're just not going to let the sunlight see it, because if we do, it might get taken away.
Yeah.
Um, to when I came about, that, protectionism is still certainly something we're concerned about all the time,
Yeah.
in a somewhat different context, because now we're concerned because we're regaining some of these knowledges. We're restoring our languages. We're restoring some of these knowledge systems, some of these understandings, some of these networks of relations. And there's a concern of, well, we want to protect that refostering of all of that energy. So in terms of how I approached it, it was about, folks ahead of me made sure the story didn't die.
Hmm.
Okay. Then another generation is there to then tell the story
Right.
and to counter the story that is being told. And this is very important. And that comes with its challenges for sure. But to have the voice to say, actually, start positioning other ways of thinking or of being. And then what that led to, and I think the sort of era we're in now, is now more Indigenous people have access to some of these systems, and we're sort of integrating into them
Hmm.
for good and bad, because there's some transformation to those systems when that happens on both sides, that
Yeah.
is good and bad. And we're seeing the output, like in terms of cultural output in
Yeah.
Canada. Indigenous storytellers are now front and center at the CSAs and all of, talking about award shows, all of
Yeah.
our award shows.
Yeah. All the best music is currently being made by Indigenous artists in this country,
Yeah,
100%.
and
Yeah.
the TV shows and play, like all of that,
Yeah.
the product of culture is there. More importantly to me, and probably not the part that I spoke, because I tended to deal with cultural product,
Right.
but my interest was always what produced. And so my interest in the point of getting Indigenous people involved in cultural product creation in Canada and having that ingested into Canadian was to change the actual culture,
Right.
was to shift. And I think, and again, I'm not alone. This was a mass group community effort of a whole bunch of artists and folks who did this over generations. I think we've been relatively successful in terms of, like, in the face of, extinction,
Hmm.
complete dissolution of our nations, and that we resisted to the point where now I'm having this conversation with you and maybe trying to impart some. So I think Canada can think of, like, well, what is most important, and what do we protect? I think in these moments of disruption, as hard as it is, because one of the tactics of these sorts of things, moments of change,
Hmm.
is this sort of sense of frenzy, this,
Yes.
like, let's do so much. And certainly one of my teachings would be, in those moments of frenzy, it's actually incumbent on you to slow down.
Hmm.
That when the machine is trying to get you to do this,
Yeah.
you actually have to do the exact opposite and pause. It doesn't mean you can't react, and you should react in the moment when harm is being done, but it means that the solutions you seek are actually probably long term and require some deep consideration and movement. Because again, the situation we're in now, where this is all happening to us, is not because of decisions made last week.
Right.
These are decisions.
We got here through decades of decision making sort of brought us to this place.
Decades of policy, both economic and cultural, and all this sort of stuff that arrive at this. And likewise, the solutions are not likely to be overcome. And so, like, the booing of national anthems, like, to me, you know, I guess I would take it back to, why do we have national anthems at sporting events? Like, why is this the venue we have chosen where we celebrate that particular style of patriotism for, and again, on a professional level, for what is largely a corporate sort of thing? Like, these are billion-dollar entities. We're really wrapping up nationalism into that. And granted, from the American perspective, maybe that makes all the sense in the world. But from the rest of us, maybe we should go, maybe that exposes us to, like, and again, I'm thinking to previous eras when anthems, relatively recent, in terms of some people behaving when anthems were sung at sporting events. You mentioned the Iraq, like, there's a history where this is an issue, and maybe we should just consider, is that the venue for that sort of patriotism?
Or is that the lever, right? Like, is that the lever that we need to pull in order to sort of reinforce our actual cultural identity? Like, the idea that, like, just because you boo another national anthem does not a culture make. It just says, you know, oh, we don't like this because of what's happening to us right now.
And that's totally fair. And I don't want to say people shouldn't do that. People shouldn't. If you want to cancel your Netflix, rock and roll. For me, it's always more about what is the 30-year goal. And the 30-year goal for me would be a more resilient Canadian culture that is less prone to being activated by these actions, and where we can take pride in our own cultural products because we have a deeper understanding of our own culture.
So, Jesse, it's not lost on me that, like, I've asked you 2 questions and we've already exhausted most of the time we have on the radio. I'm going to hold on to you and keep talking. That's okay. We're going to keep talking just a little bit longer after the end of the radio show. People can maybe find the longer version of the conversation. But just with the time that we have for the people who are listening on the radio right now, you're familiar with all these cultural institutions that we have, the Council for the Arts, the CBC. How are they holding up? How are they holding up in terms of trying to advance and maintain Canadian culture? As from where you sit, how is that process actually going?
You know, it's up and down. You know, I take I long view. I wouldn't necessarily review, like, yesterday is where we're going to decide to see how they're doing. But I think they're generally doing okay. I think we are up. I think it's important to recognize what we are up against, which is like an enormous culture that is imperial in its nature, and in this moment is expansionist in terms of that viewpoint. So, like, that's hard. So we shouldn't punish ourselves too much. But at the same time, is it a good moment? Any moment is a good one. This seems like just as fine as any to think about what's important to us. What is it that makes us distinct from anywhere else? How can we begin to foster that, and how can we invest in what is going to, basically, how can we invest in each other? Which might be more investing in Canadian culture than always investing in theirs. I get we're all going to go see the Marvel movie. I'm not blaming anyone. I saw Star Wars. That's what got me interested in movies as a kid. That's an American, very much a product of America. I get it. But it then activated for me to go, well, how can we do this here? And I think that maybe is the energy, and again, how I can do it for my people as well. Maybe that's the energy that we need to focus on, is like, how can we make stuff here, culturally, industrially, all sorts of ways, that foster that sense of belonging here, that makes us more resilient to these sorts of actors on the international stage.
I think the thing that I'm really sensitive to is that we are having a conversation on an arts and entertainment and pop culture show, a show that is meant to be talking about the movies and the music that we make and the TV shows that we watch. And what I wanted to do with this episode is have a wider conversation about being like, okay, what does it mean to step back? What does it mean to step back and say, actually, there's something greater going on here? And I think that's worth us sort of thinking about and reflecting about. And the reason I wanted to have you on is to say, there are a lot of people who are going to be new to the conversation about cultural imperialism. And I wanted to frame it in the sense of, you are an agent. You and I and everybody around us, we're all agents in terms of, like, the choices that we make, partly in terms of what we consume and partly in terms of what we actually, like, show actual interest in. Jesse, I'm just going to say goodbye to our radio audience right now, and then we'll keep this conversation going if you don't mind. So do you want to say goodbye to the radio audience real quick?
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for my lack of brevity, but stay well, everyone. Stay calm in all of these situations, and I hope to see you at a show soon.
I think they forgive you. Okay. Jesse Wente is, of course, a regular columnist right here on Commotion. He was not speaking to us today in his official capacity as a chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. He also wrote a great book called Unreconciled Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance. By the way, Friday on Commotion, we're going to be talking more about how other countries kind of grapple with America's cultural influence. Come back for that as well. In the meantime, we're going to say goodbye to the radio audience. This conversation will be longer on our podcast feed. Find it wherever you get Commotion. Okay, Jesse, I want to continue this conversation with you because there was so much to keep talking about.
I'm so out of practice with this radio thing, Elamin.
That's okay. Hey, listen, that's a part of what we're doing here. Can I just, if you don't mind, can I just play you the booing at the national anthem this weekend? Let's just hear a little bit of it.
Yeah.
Does it surprise you, in this entire larger cultural conversation, that that's the first thing that people sort of reach for? The idea of, what, nationalism is the only lever that I can pull, and so I'm going to lean towards the world of nationalism. Or is it kind of to be expected in these moments?
I think it's probably to be expected. I mean, because again, the messaging we're getting from the Trump folks is pretty America first, right? So like they're wrapping themselves in a nationalistic blanket. I think it's quite natural that you'd have that same reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's like in a sort of immediate sense, it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
The anthem playing is like at a sporting event is sort of like a message thing. If you want to boo it, that's also a message thing. So you're sort of in dialogue. So yeah, I think that's not to be unexpected. And I'd also say like we live in a culture where sporting events is one of the venues where we actually gather together on like in person en masse. We don't do that in a lot of venues anyway, right?
No.
Like that is increasingly not something we do. And so it wouldn't at all surprise me when you actually gather 20,000 Canadians together and like that, that's going to happen. So especially in these eras. So I don't fault anyone. I just think let's dive deeper is always where I'm at.
So the reason I'm asking that is because I want to contextualize this question. We talked about like the Canadian cultural institutions like the Council for the Arts, like the CBC, institutions that were created because of the Massey Commission. Their purpose is to say, okay, we are going to be intentional and protectionist about defining and protecting Canadian culture. Where does the cultural impulse emanate from in America? Like where do they have the same thing? Do they start from a place of like we should protect American culture, or does it sound and feel entirely different in America?
Well, I think it sounds and feels entirely different, which is not to say that their national identity is not very much intertwined with their entertainment product. It certainly is.
Of course it is, yes.
Their entertainment product is certainly a reflection of their sort of national myth making and national storytelling, as is in Canada.
Yeah.
But I would say their main driver of culture is profit, which I think speaks to their culture, sort of what drives any cultural production. And it's bad to say that totally. That's the systemic answer. Of course, there's artists in the US who aren't seeking profit and are there to do other things. That's, what I'm talking about is the industrial sort of production of cultural content is there as a profit-driven sort of thing, which has not historically been the way Canada has viewed that. Thus, we have a public broadcaster as opposed to what they have in the US and those sorts of things. So theirs is largely profit driven. And I think it's important to note in the moment to see where the folks who head those profit driven entities are aligning, because that might indicate sort of what the cultural product might begin to look like. And listen, we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but like we also know that cultural product can become a weapon of the state in certain instances, and we've seen this happen globally. And we know how that transition occurs and what it then looks like, because we've witnessed this elsewhere. we should just watch for the signs of that occurring south of the border. And, you know, to bring us back to sort of the top of the conversation, Elamin, I think in this moment, it's key to recognize that Canadians might be feeling what many other countries have felt under American imperialism. Because
Yes.
while they haven't used these sorts of powers on us that often,
Yeah.
that does not mean they don't exercise this sort of thing all the time. Like any Canadian who's been to Cuba certainly knows that America exercises all sorts of cultural will over other countries all the time, and it can get much worse. So all of us to sort of watch, be educated, and remember that all of this is not new. A lot of this is sort of cyclical stuff, and we know people that we know knowledge about these things, and just be aware and conscious, and we also know how to resist. And I think that's, you know, that's been the focus of our conversation today for sure.
So we pause with the people who are making these choices to resist. I just want to maybe close on this kind of framing, this framing of people who are spending their time and they're saying, you know what, I'm going to make a different choice. I'm not gonna watch Netflix. I'm not gonna watch Severance, even though it's the most popular show on TV right now. They are trying to avoid American culture. How do you, you know, when you see those choices, what does that make you think about?
I mean, so the first thing I would say, because I saw certainly on my remaining social media, Facebook, there, the social media for my generation, uh, uh, you know, all sorts of folks saying I'm canceling my Netflix,
Yeah.
which is a totally valid, you know, I get it. I think it's important to keep in mind, and I know this has been explained by other folks, because of the decisions made in previous generations, all industries these days are so intertwined internationally
Yeah.
that, like, you have Canadian producers who are trying to produce through Netflix. Like, that's their distribution system.
That is, yes.
And just like it's like we can't, like, it's hard to say, oh, I'm going to boycott GM. Well,
It's a bit
like,
tough to do that.
sure,
Yeah.
but like, we understand that we make a lot of GM cars, and so it's one of those things with culture. And now, which is not to say don't do it.
No.
And it's not to say that we shouldn't maybe start to think about how we could maybe, it's going to be tough to like fully unwind, but start to think about, can we build other things that might be here, and sort of allow those things locally. Um, in terms of like the consumption of cultural product, I would certainly encourage people. You know, we certainly have very viable and good streaming services here in Canada that I think have lots of great shows.
Mm-hmm.
We don't consume enough of our own cultural products here
No, we don't.
in Canada. Um, we do make stuff that's as, listen, people come here to make their things because we're so good at making their things.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say, like, the most awarded show for the Emmys is Shogun, and that's made in British Columbia, right? Like, it's,
you got it.
they
Like,
make a show here. Yeah.
go down the Oscars, any of that stuff. And so those are our folks doing that stuff. You can consume our shows and it would be the same folks, a lot of the same folks making that same thing, and they're just as good. So I do think that energy is great. And like, whether you're making travel decisions or all those sorts of things, I think anytime we invest in ourselves, which is, and whether we want to think of that as a national or community level, and I would certainly say, before we even think of national, like, let's just think about how we can activate our communities and how we can make the bonds together, and maybe start even thinking about how local economies could grow and strengthen, because a lot of that's been eroded over the last 30, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of that activity is fantastic, and we should do that deep thinking and start laying the groundwork. It may take 30 years to rebuild that stuff. That's okay. Let's start. There's a lot of good that will occur in that process. And then I would also say, for those that haven't canceled, that's also okay. Like, let's be gentle with ourselves while we can build things that are long term going to benefit us. And I think, as a nation, and here I'll speak maybe as someone who sometimes has difficulty with Canadianness.
Yes.
But what I would say is, I think there's so much possibility in all of these things, and we have so much, you know, awesome stuff here that we could engage in, and I think would help Canadians feel more a part of this place in a way that would ease some of the anxiety we have about our relationships, all that stuff. And listen, some of that means that, like, Indigenous folks, we can help, and also we need the help to help. And let's think about how we can build that resiliency together.
Mm.
Because again, one of the things I would always remind Canadians is, if you want stories that can exist no place else, they're Indigenous stories. You can't get an Anishinaabe story in France. That's not a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So let's invest in some of what makes us distinct and makes us feel connected to each other. And frankly, turning off Netflix and getting out in the world is probably a great place to start for all of us. Like, let's be honest, Elamin. I know we love the shows.
Yeah.
But we could visit once in a while, you and I. We could get together, Elamin, and see each other in the flesh.
I think that's a really beautiful and lovely place to leave it. I think like there's a lot of wisdom here. Jesse, I really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elamin. And again, I apologize to you and the producers for my my verboseness.
Your verboseness is very much the reason why we have you on the show. Because I want you to sort of build and build and build on these ideas. And honestly, like, look, it's not lost on me that people come to our show because they are ready to have a conversation about a movie that just came out, about a TV show that everybody's talking about. And every once in a while, exactly. And every once in a while, we say, it's not just about the thing that's happening on your TV. It's about how we got there. And that's what this conversation has been about. And I really appreciate your energy and your thoughtfulness about that conversation. So thank you so much, man.
Well, I appreciate the space. I appreciate the technical crew's patience with me as I got frustrated with the technical aspects of production this morning, but we're all good. Thanks for having me on. Hopefully I can come back at some point and talk about a goofy movie or something. We can do that again.
Any goofy movie you want to talk about, pal, let's go. I am ready. Right. Absolutely. Jesse Wente is a regular here on Commotion, and while he was not speaking to us today in his official capacity, he's the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. Friday, by the way, we're going to be having that conversation about American imperialism. In the meantime, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. See you tomorrow.